Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Battlefield 1 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the 15th installment in the Battlefield series, following, of course, Battlefield Hardline. It was developed by EA, DICE, and published by Electronic Arts in October of this year. And it went on to receive a ludicrous amount of acclaim, people acting like it's the best thing since sliced bread. And if you've seen my MTO on the beta of this, you know I wasn't really enthused with it. But I thought I would give them the benefit of the doubt and wait until I got my hands on the full game to do a full assessment of it. And the end result is something that made me wonder why I even bother with the Battlefield series anymore. So let's go ahead and tear into this thing and find out what exactly went wrong and what, if anything, it does well. And we'll do this by starting with the presentation, which is the one thing that the game does extremely well. It's got great modeling, very solid animations, the texture quality is very high, and the attention to detail is definitely impressive. I mean, it's down to things like the water droplets collecting on your guns when you're in the middle of a rainstorm, and that sort of thing really does help it quite a lot in the long run. It is a very visually impressive game, and the sound design is also very impressive, as it always is from DICE. You've got very nice, beefy, concussive sound effects where explosions actually rock you around. You've got the distinct crack of rifle fire in the distance. You've got really nice, punchy weapon sounds that really do make you feel like you're wielding powerful weapons as opposed to garbage. And in the middle of all of the chaos, you really do feel like it's actually immersing you in the experience because the sound design is just that damn good. And there's the voice acting, which isn't going to win any awards, don't get me wrong, but they definitely did a good job with it. The characters are voiced rather well for the most part, and there's nothing really out of place with them. And when you get into the battle chatter, everybody's speaking the appropriate language that they're supposed to be speaking, and it actually sounds rather good. The only real letdown with the sound design is the music, which is basically generic war movie music that is entirely forgettable and to the point where you barely even notice it's there unless you turn the music all the way up. Luckily, they allow you to turn down the volume of the music in the multiplayer now, because in the beta they didn't let you do that and it was constantly overpowering everything else. And we would much rather be hearing the chaos of the war around us than a rather generic orchestral kind of thing. Although even with that blemish, the sound design is still extremely well done overall. And going back to the visuals for just a moment, the performance generally is very good as well. Most of the time it runs at a solid 60 frames a second or higher, or at least close to 60 frames a second. On certain maps and modes you will get a bit of slowdown, but that's kind of to be expected when there's a lot of stuff going on all at once. There's a lot of particle effects going on all over the place and that sort of thing. It really is going to tax your system more. It doesn't really excuse it from the glitches that you'll run into, most of which are certainly not game-breaking or anything of that nature. They're just mildly annoying at worst, but they're definitely a detriment to the game. I mean, you have instances like this where the guy is floating and clipping in and out of existence, and it's just weird. Or moments like this, where there's tons of artifacting going on. It's just kind of a mess sometimes. And speaking of a mess, the visuals, while certainly very impressive, also sometimes get in the way of actually playing the game. Just because the lighting is a certain way, you'll not be able to see much of anything, or there's a big fog or a dust storm or something along those lines obscuring your vision. And even worse, a fair bit of that is actually client-side, so you might be seeing a dust storm and somebody else might not be seeing a dust storm, and that makes it extremely easy for them to pick you off from a long range. This is one of those weird instances where sometimes it's actually easier to play it on lower graphics settings simply because it makes it easier to see what you're doing. And of course that's something that's plagued all of the Frostbite engine Battlefield games, but it's especially annoying in this one. So even the really good parts of the presentation end up being something of a double-edged sword. But then we come to what really matter here, which are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is split across 6 different so-called war stories that are basically just mini campaigns. The first of which it actually forces you into upon starting the game, without letting you mess with any of the settings for the graphics, or any of your controls, or anything of that nature, until about halfway through the level. Keep in mind, I get nauseous with FOVs lower than about 90 degrees, and the default FOV for this is right around 65 degrees. Not to mention, I don't really use the standard controls for the Battlefield games. I mess around with them a fair bit, so already it was getting on my bad side. Can we just stop that trend of immediately throwing you into the game without letting you go to the options menu first. Is that too much to ask? I mean, I know you're ready to get into the game and play it when you start it up, but you at least probably want to go to the options menu first to make sure everything's configured the way you like it, right? I mean, am I completely out of touch here? I mean, even console players want that. They want to be able to get into the options menu and mess with the sensitivity settings and the button layouts and such, so they don't feel like they're just fumbling around with a gamepad. Anyway, mini rant aside, it throws you immediately into the level known as Storm of Steel, which is a single campaign in and of itself. And it's easily the best level in the entirety of the single player. It starts you off and takes place in 1918 and basically says, this is frontline combat, you are not expected to survive, World War I was a total meat grinder. And then that mission proceeds to basically do that. You end up going through a series of basically unwinnable battles where when you die, you get switched over to the perspective of a different soldier, and whenever that happens, you see the name of that soldier that you were just playing and their date of birth and date of death, which is actually surprisingly interesting. I don't know if I've ever seen anything quite like that in a first-person shooter before. And even more interesting than simply just switching between the perspectives, most of the time you're actually playing as the Harlem Hellfighters. They were an all-black American infantry regiment that got shipped over to the French because the Americans didn't want to actually fight with them at the time, and the French were like, hey, more bodies for the front, so they equipped them and sent them out into the fight, and they actually have a really good service record. So basically, right from the get-go, it's like, hey, we're going to be different, we're going to be interesting, and we're going to try to do World War I some justice. And then the ending cutscene of Storm of Steel happens, in which he goes, these are our stories, and it brings up the campaign menu. At which point you select one of the other war stories in really any order that you want, and you're like, hey, this is going to be awesome if Storm of Steel's any indication. And every single one of them is incredibly terrible. They are numbered, but there's really no order in which you need to go through them. You can pick any of the other 5 war stories and play through them at your leisure. The first of them is one of the 2 longest ones, and it's known as Through Mud and Blood. It's a basically 4-level mini-campaign in which you play as Danny Edwards, a British tank driver. And the idea there is that you're going to use your tank to break through the German line and make it all the way to Cambrai. And right from the get-go, it is very problematic because you're using a Mark V land ship to take out anti-tank positions. You know, big ol' field guns that basically shred them. And on top of that, they throw quite a lot of tanks at you as if the tank-on-tank battles were a commonplace thing in World War I. In reality, they were very, very uncommon. But I digress. The point is that you're in a tank taking out AT positions because that somehow makes sense. And then you have to get out of the tank in the next level to lead the tank through the fog, and in doing so, you find out that the driver of the tank is actually Rambo, because he can mow down hundreds upon hundreds of German soldiers like it's nothing. And this is where the primary problem with all of the campaigns comes into very, very sharp focus. You're not actually playing soldiers on the battlefield. You're basically playing Rambo characters. Characters that are so unbelievably badass that the only way to kill them off is by total plot contrivance. You see, Danny Edwards is a fresh recruit to the war. He has basically no combat experience whatsoever, yet here he is mowing down hordes of Germans like it's nothing. Basically, the entirety of the Through Mud and Blood campaign can be summed up as, when you're driving the tank, it's basically little more than a turret segment in disguise, and when you're out of the tank, it's generic modern military shooter garbage. 2 weapon limit, although you do get 2 gear slots as well as brain-dead AI that will constantly be able to hit you from a mile away with extreme precision, because that's the only way they can make the game remotely challenging, along with regenerating health that pretty much renders that accuracy moot unless their entire enemy force is shooting at you all at once, along with teammates who are practically useless because they can barely hit the broadside of a barn, let alone the enemy. And then, of course, the wonders of the incredibly broken stealth system. And by broken, I mean it just barely even functions at all. It is extremely rudimentary and pretty much tacked on because you can go loud if you want, and there's really not much consequence for it other than, oh hey, all the enemies know where you are and so they're going to shoot at you now. And even more fun with that stealth system is that certain enemies can't be taken out stealthily. Good luck trying to do that with a sentry, which is one of the guys who have big old machine guns, or they'll have the aircraft submachine gun, and they're all heavily armored. Because all of the weapons with suppressors in this thing, which, might I add, were not a thing in World War I, are all pistols. And pistols are pretty much useless against the sentries because they all are very heavily armored and can take anti-tank rifle rounds to the face and be perfectly fine. I'm not joking. Look at this crap. Your eyes did not deceive you. That took 2 headshots from the Tankgewehr to take down a single sentry, or in this case, flamethrower trooper. They're pretty much the same. The only real difference between them is that one gets incendiary grenades and a flamethrower, and the other one gets a big old machine gun or an SMG that has a stupidly high rate of fire. Keep in mind that the Tankgewehr is something that in the multiplayer you have to find on the field as an elite kit, much like you would with all of the sentry kits. It is one of the most ridiculously powerful weapons in the entire game, and it still took 2 friggin' headshots to take down a single dude. That is just absurd. But to make matters worse, if you're trying to be stealthy at all, then you might as well just throw in the towel when these guys show up on the battlefield, because there's no way to take them down stealthily. You can't melee them because they're somehow immune to melee in the single player, even though you can certainly do a bayonet charge on them in the multiplayer just fine. So if you've played the multiplayer first, then you might be thinking, oh hey, maybe I can do a melee attack on them to take them down quietly. No, you can't. The only reliable way to take them down is with very heavy ordnance. At least with the flamethrower troopers, you can actually shoot their weak spot, which is their fuel tank, and they'll go up in flames. But with the sentries, there's really not a weak spot to exploit. You can kind of exploit their rear, but that's not really all that helpful. There's still bullet sponges no matter what you do. And they ruin the stealth system even further than it already was, which is pretty impressive when you start to think about it. So that level where you're in the fog, you might as well just go loud the entire time, but the problem with that is that it's not you that's gonna go down. It's the tank, because they'll just immediately spot the tank when it comes to support you whenever you go loud, and the mission's instantly over if the tank goes down, which it most certainly will when you're dealing with about 2 or 3 field guns at once. But it's not just crap like the mechanics or the asinine nature of trying to take down AT positions while in a tank, or in the case of the Friends in High Places mission, which is the 3rd in the campaign, being, hey, let's take out AA positions while in a biplane. That sounds like a great idea. Quite literally, the only excuse that the Friends in High Places mission has is that the narrator for it is very unreliable. Even then, it is idiotic as hell, no matter what way you try to slice it. And it really does feel completely out of place in the grand scheme of things, because this game takes itself so incredibly seriously. It is constantly acting like its display of World War I is supposed to be an homage to the people who survived it and lived through it. It is constantly trying to hammer home the fact that they're trying to be serious with these moments in the beginning and end of campaigns where it gives you the actual rundown of the history, and these moments throughout the campaigns where it's being overly melodramatic with supposed character moments that ultimately fail miserably because you're introduced to characters who have barely any personality to them at all, if any at all, and they're either killed off very quickly or they're just there for the course of maybe 2 or 3 missions. You don't have time to bond to anybody, so why do you give a crap? I mean, hell, the 4th and 5th campaigns in particular try to play up the character aspect, because the 4th campaign is called Avanti Savoia, and you're playing as an Italian soldier who is trying to find his brother in the midst of very heavy fighting in the Alps against the Austro-Hungarians. And it tries to convey this very serious character drama by having you don a very heavy suit of metal armor and carry an MG 0815 and storm up a mountain as fucking Rambo. Quite honestly, I don't give a single solitary about your, oh, there was so much fire and I couldn't look at the bodies anymore, because you're pretty much an unstoppable juggernaut of death. No, really, you actually heal damage faster than the enemy can dish it out to you on that level. It is ridiculous. Even more ridiculous is that immediately after that, you take down an entire squadron of air support by yourself. And then in the next campaign, the runner, you play as a guy named Frederick Bishop, who's an Australian scout message runner kind of guy, who ends up sort of kind of bonding with a fresh recruit, even though he just met the guy and knows basically nothing about him, and they barely even have any interactions at all. But oh no, the Bishop's gotta save him because he just has this duty to this guy for some reason. And so to do this, he storms an entire fully garrisoned Ottoman fort by himself. In fact, he even comments on how incredibly stupid it is that he is actually charging through that fort. But no matter how stupid it is, you're gonna do it anyway, because this is a generic modern military shooter and you're not playing an actual soldier in World War I, you're playing an action movie hero. And it really doesn't help that this particular mini-campaign also has the incredibly stupid misfortune of being set in 1915, and thus it actually ends up having anachronisms, like the MP-18 Experimental, a 3-round burst variant of the MP-18 submachine gun. Quite honestly, you would have to be incredibly stupid to not understand why this is a problem. Never mind the fact that the 1903 Springfield with the Pedersen devices attached to them are a thing in the multiplayer, so they gotta throw them in the single player somewhere, even though they never actually saw service. In fact, there's a lot of stuff in this game that never actually saw service, but is still thrown into the game anyway because DICE operates on rule of cool and nothing more. And don't give me that crap about, oh, it's an alternate history World War I, because it's fucking not. Anyway, mini tirade aside, nothing is written, basically just has you starting out being rather stealthy, and then from there you're pretty much given reign to do whatever you want. Because of course you're this unstoppable badass who is basically the right hand of Lawrence of Arabia. Because, you know, gotta have Lawrence of Arabia in there because it's World War I, right? But anyway, this particular campaign is rather problematic if you want to be remotely stealthy, because it tends to throw a fair few sentries at you, and that just throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing. After all, the only stealth you really need there is to be able to sneak into the enemy base and grab a tank, in which case you're pretty much unstoppable at that point. But no matter how you play it, it's pretty much just another modern military shooter mini-campaign, and there's nothing at all special about it. If anything, the fact that the game takes itself so incredibly seriously while also having these campaigns, where most of the writing feels like it was just scribbled together on a few napkins by some drunk at a bar, means that the campaigns are downright insulting to your intelligence. Especially when it is constantly trying to hammer home the horrors of war and the character-driven moments and try to make it emotional, and then you have the stupidity of things like a tank taking on AT positions, or an aircraft taking on anti-air positions, or storming up a mountain in extremely heavy armor being effectively immune to everything. In fact, an airplane crashes on you at one point, and you turn out to be perfectly fine, completely uninjured, which is just plain bullshit. But quite honestly, the bit that pissed me off the absolute most about the campaigns was the bit where you play as a pigeon. I'm not joking. They release a pigeon at one particular part of the Through Mud and Blood campaign, and you are controlling this pigeon as it flies back to command to give artillery coordinates. And I am utterly baffled as to why they thought it was a good idea to put into the game. It adds literally nothing to it other than some pointless busywork. You just direct the pigeon to wherever this weird glowy circle is, and that's it. It's just a really short interlude that you could remove entirely from the game, and it would actually be better for it in the long run, because, frankly, the segment where you're flying around as a pigeon is pretty ridiculous. If they want their game to be taken so damn seriously, then they need to actually take it seriously themselves, instead of just saying, we're going to throw in whatever the hell we feel like, and we're going to make it a generic modern military shooter. And that is, quite frankly, the absolute worst thing they could have done for World War I, because World War I is drastically underrepresented in video games, particularly in first-person shooters, and so such a high-profile release as this one deserves a massive amount of care and respect for the source material. Instead, they used it as a playground, and it is both insulting to your intelligence, it plays nearly the same as any other modern military shooter on the market, only worse, because DICE has never been good at making single-player games, and at this one, they pretty much just said, screw it, we're just gonna not give a crap about actually improving anything. And thus, everything in the single-player campaign feels tacked on, and at the very best, like a glorified tutorial for multiplayer. And on top of that, the writing in this thing is so pitiful that it makes Doom Repercussions of Evil look like a masterpiece at times. But quite honestly, the thing that pisses me off the most about the single-player in this is that it is downright insulting to the memory of World War I. It completely trivializes the whole thing, while also trying to maintain this facade of, oh, we really care about the source material. We really care about these things that happened about 100 years ago. Really, we do! Fact of the matter is that DICE used World War I as their playground, and they just made something incredibly stupid as a result. And quite frankly, if you actually, for some utterly baffling reason, like the single player, you have officially lost my respect. Because I can see literally no reason whatsoever to like the single player in this game. It is terrible in all respects. The gameplay is awful. The story and the characters are pathetically written. The overall tone is just ridiculous. And yet it's constantly trying to act like it's some masterpiece of storytelling. DICE, please do us all a favor. Stop putting single player in your Battlefield games. Because first off, barely anybody even gives a crap about single player in a Battlefield game in the first place, and second, they're all terrible, and they're only getting worse. So just stop it. While you're at it, can you stop making your multiplayer worse with every single installment instead of better? Honestly, I don't really know where to begin, but I guess I'll start with the game modes that they completely screwed up. There are currently 6 modes available in the game. You have your basic team deathmatch, which is exactly what you would expect. You have Rush, which is pretty much what you would expect after having played it in, of course, Battlefield Bad Company on up through Battlefield Hardline. And it's basically the attacking team has a limited number of respawn tickets, and they have to destroy 2 points on the map, and the defending team is trying to prevent them from doing that. If the attackers manage to destroy both of those particular points, then their respawn tickets are replenished and they move on to the next section of the map and repeat the process, until eventually either they run out of respawn tickets, in which case the defenders win, or if they destroy all the points, in which case the attackers win. The only real change they made to that particular mode is that the points themselves are now telegraph stations that the defending team can actually use to call in artillery strikes on the enemy's position. This may sound slightly overpowered, considering that the defense was already ridiculously powerful to begin with, considering they don't have to worry about respawn tickets, but that's actually not that big of a bonus for them. Unless the attacking team is pretty much stationary, the artillery is really not going to have that much of an effect on them. But other than that, it's pretty much the same as the Rush mode from any of the other Battlefield games. It's a mode that's never really felt like it's had much of a place in the Battlefield series, because it really doesn't facilitate combined arms gameplay all that well. And in Battlefield 1, that's no exception. It still is very infantry-centric, and it's pretty bland and uninteresting, particularly if you've played a fair bit of Battlefields, of course, between Bad Company and Battlefield Hardline, because you've probably played quite a bit of Rush. Of course, if you're just talking about the amount of time you've played something in a Battlefield game, of course, the main mode is Conquest, which is pretty much the signature mode for the Battlefield series, where both teams are competing over 5 positions on the map, and by holding these positions, they deplete their enemy's spawn tickets quicker, right? Well, no, not in Battlefield 1. Instead of having spawn tickets like you did in all of the previous Battlefield games in the Conquest mode, now the Conquest mode is quite literally just domination, only it has the tanks and the aircraft on the battlefield, and it's 5 positions on the map instead of 3. No spawn tickets. You each start with 0 points, and you are competing until you get the absolute maximum number of points for that particular server. This may not seem like much of a change. In fact, for a lot of people it may sound like a good thing, except it completely changes the dynamic of gameplay. because now nobody is really incentivized to play a medic. The only two modes where a medic is incentivized are Team Deathmatch and Rush. In Team Deathmatch, if you revive your teammates, then they don't count as kills for the enemy team, and in Rush, of course, you have your limited number of respawn tickets, so you need as many people staying on the field as possible, preventing them from respawning and digging into that ticket count. Medics were absolutely vital in Conquest before because you had the limited number of respawn tickets and you needed everyone on the point trying to capture it and hold it. In Battlefield 1, on the other hand, barely anyone plays a medic in the Conquest mode. Almost everyone runs around as the other three classes, and it's pretty disproportionate as to which ones they run around as, by the way. But really, what reason do people have for playing a medic? It's actually one of the worst classes in the entire game. If all you want to do is heal people and revive people, then that's your class, because the actual weapons that they use, their combat capabilities, are surprisingly wimpy. They're saddled with only semi-automatic rifles to use, and at longer ranges they do barely any damage. At close range they are completely outclassed by shotguns and submachine guns, and at medium range, LMGs and even sniper rifles will do the job just fine. And really, I think that's the primary reason people don't play medics. It's not just because they're not really all that useful outside of a couple of game modes, but it's also simply because their weapons just aren't that good. But I digress. Such a simple change that they made to the Conquest mode actually makes it considerably worse in the long run. Whereas in previous Battlefield games, in the Conquest mode, you absolutely had to work as a team to be able to win, now you have pretty much everyone running around like headless chickens, not really knowing what they're doing, and really only playing the Conquest mode because it's the 64-player mode. Sure, there are still some people playing the objective, and they're the ones that you really want to stick with because they'll know what they're doing, but for the most part, people playing this thing are basically Call of Duty converts. They're more concerned with their KD ratio than anything else, and that is just not remotely conducive to Battlefield, certainly not something like the Conquest mode. That's not to say that it's not on display in the other modes as well, but Conquest is the main combined arms mode, where you have lots of people running around with tanks and aircraft, and like always, the aircraft really don't lend all that much to their team. They might be very useful for taking down an enemy airship, but other than that, they're mostly just dogfighting each other. Which I have to say is easier said than done, because the controls for flying in the Battlefield series have never been good to begin with, but they're really bad in this one too, because they take more after Star Wars Battlefront 2015 than they do anything else. Good luck flying the planes in this if you're not using a gamepad or a joystick, because keyboard and mouse controls for flying in this thing are downright horrible, which is also probably why they're really not that useful to their teams, but I digress. Of course, one of the other big problems with the Conquest mode is that it tends to take absolutely forever to finish a match. So if you're like me and you're actually pretty limited on the amount of time that you can actually play video games, you might want to look into the other modes and see how they are, but then you run into the problems of, well, there's TDM, which is just any other team deathmatch mode, only it's Battlefield, so you can revive people to prevent the enemy team from getting a point. And there's Rush, which we've already talked about, and then there's Domination, which is basically the Conquest mode, only there's no combined arms, and it's only 3 points on the map instead of 5, meaning it's designed for much quicker play sessions. And then, of course, there's the Operations mode, which is something that is a bit interesting in concept, but in reality ends up being more trouble than it's worth. The best way I can describe it is that it's basically like the Rush mode mixed in with the campaign-style stuff from enemy territory. The idea is that the attacking team does have a limited number of respawn tickets, and they have 2 positions they need to capture. These positions are not like in the Rush mode where they're points they need to destroy. They're actually flags that they need to capture, meaning that the defenders can actually recapture them if they end up getting captured by the attackers. Once both positions are captured, then it moves on into the next area of the map, and it repeats this process up until you get to the very, very end of the map, in which case the attackers win if they capture the points, and the defenders win if they manage to reduce the enemy's ticket count to 0. The thing is, if the attackers win, then it moves on to the next map in the campaign, and you repeat the process. If the defenders win, then it moves on into the second round of the defense, and the attacking team either gets an armored train or an airship to support them. Now, the armored train and the airship are only a once per round thing, so if it gets destroyed, then it's destroyed for the rest of that round, and they don't get another one. But this really does create a very different dynamic because, particularly in confined maps like that, the airship is pretty much ridiculously overpowered. The defending team really doesn't get much in the way of anti-air defenses, so when you're actually trying to deal with the airships, you find that more often than not you end up having to have a bunch of scouts trying to hit it with K-bullets, which are the armor-piercing rounds that they can get. And that's really not all that helpful. You would have to have pretty much your entire team focus fire on the thing and avoid the points entirely in order to be able to take the thing down in any conceivable amount of time with just infantry. If the defending team does get an aircraft, they basically get a single plane to mess around with, and while that is a godsend for the airship battle, they can go down rather easily, and particularly if your pilots suck, then, well, good luck with that. The armored train, on the other hand, can be blasted to living hell and back with anti-tank weaponry as well as the high-explosive mortar that the support gets, so that's really not overpowered at all. Especially considering that it can only see a very limited part of the map at any given time, whereas the airship is flying high above the battlefield. They can pretty much see wherever you are, and while you do have to lead your targets when you're shooting from the airship, you have infinite ammo, so you don't really need to worry too much about anything. And keep in mind, the airship and the armored train are both on top of the vehicles that the attacking team can get. So they'll come at you with tanks, they'll come at you with the train, they'll come at you with the airships, and they'll come at you with aircraft all at the same time, and it can just completely overwhelm your team. As a result, playing on the defensive team can get incredibly frustrating, particularly considering that you have to defend against 3 waves of the attacking team coming at you. And in both the second and the third rounds of that, they get their big heavy airship or armored train support. So if you don't have a really well organized team that knows what they're doing, then that can be incredibly problematic because, well, they just won't be able to organize the defense and your team's just going to get slaughtered. I think their idea there was that the rush mode was very heavily biased toward the defending team rather than the attacking team, so they wanted something to try to even up the odds. The problem being that with the airship in particular, there's really not much you can do against that unless you actually have a good AA support. But really, that's not even the biggest problem with the operations mode. It's the fact that it only runs on matchmaking, and it's either 40 or 64 players, and you need at least 20 players to start the match. So this is pretty much what happens every single time. Now what you're seeing there is a very highly sped up clip of me sitting there waiting for the match to begin. Now the issue with that isn't so much that it took it a while to begin, it's that it almost always takes it a really long time to start. I am not remotely exaggerating when I say that it has actually taken me upwards of half an hour to be able to get a single operations match going. That is how much of a ghost town the operations mode is. During prime time, you can generally get into a match with it. It might take you several minutes, but you can get into one. But if you play in off times at all, then, well, good luck. And that's regardless of whether you're playing the 64-player or the 40-player mode, because it really doesn't matter. The entire operations mode is pretty much a ghost town. This is why it would be a really good idea for them to actually put the operations mode in the server browser instead of simply having it as matchmaking. Anyway, moving on to the final mode that's available in the game, War Pigeons. The idea is that you grab a pigeon, you run off and you write a message, and then if the bird manages to deliver the message, then the enemy gets an artillery barrage called down on top of them. And if you get 3 of those, you win, or if you get more than the enemy team within a 20-minute time limit, then you win the match as well. It's basically single flag capture the flag, only it's a pigeon, and you actually need to write a message at some point as well. It's kind of a bizarre mode, and I'm not really sure why they decided it would be a great idea to include it, but it's not really something that I give much of a crap about either. It's not really the kind of mode that emphasizes teamwork like a Battlefield game is supposed to. Instead, it ends up being more of a clusterfuck than anything else. And a lot of that is due to the way they've set up the classes. Most people are going to be playing the Assault and Support classes, with a secondary emphasis on Scouts depending on the map. The Assault class gets all the anti-tank weapons, and they use submachine guns and shotguns, which are all extremely good from the hip. In fact, submachine guns are, oddly enough, a bit more accurate from the hip than they are aimed, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And if somebody is anywhere remotely close to you with an automatico, well, just good luck with that, because you're just going to get mowed down before you even know what hit you. At least the MP18 has slow enough of a rate of fire that you can sort of react to it, but with the Automatico, it is just basically, you're dead. Similarly, if an assault class is anywhere remotely close to you with an A10 shotgun, then you're just dead. There's no getting around it. You're just dead. Even at medium range, that thing is stupidly powerful. And speaking of medium range, the support is supposed to be more for medium range engagements. They, of course, can drop ammo and they get mortars, but they also are given access to all the light machine guns in the game. The problem with that is that the light machine guns don't really behave like you would expect them to. They actually get more accurate with sustained fire than they are with just firing in bursts, because apparently DICE seems to think that makes sense. I don't really know what universe they live in, but that's not remotely how accuracy with a fully automatic weapon works. They also barely do any damage, so you end up having to land quite a lot of shots on somebody to bring them down, which means that, oddly enough, an LMG will generally lose out to an SMG or a shotgun, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Speaking of not making much sense, the Scout class is the one with all of the bolt-action rifles. Never mind that bolt-action, lever-action, and just single-shot rifles and such like that were pretty much the only weapons that the infantry were using in World War I. So if this thing were even remotely historically accurate, pretty much everyone would be running around with bolt-action rifles, and the submachine guns, LMGs, and shotguns and such would be much more specialized weaponry. In fact, pretty much all of the machine guns would be fired from fixed positions because, unlike what the game would have you believe, those things are pretty damn heavy. They're not really the kind of thing that you're going to be firing very effectively from the hip or from a shouldered position, simply because, well, good luck hoisting that thing around when it weighs a good 60 pounds unloaded. And even the ones that a single infantryman could run around with are surprisingly heavy. I mean, a BAR is a good 20-something pounds, as is a Bonnet Merci. You're not really going to be doing any real spry maneuvers with that sort of thing. You're going to want to be firing that thing from a prone position, not how the game expects you to do it, which is just running around like a normal infantryman shooting it like it's just a rifle or something. But I digress. The LMGs are rather easy to use because there's barely any recoil, and even with the shot spread, you're at least giving suppressive fire for your team. The Scouts, on the other hand, are more of a liability than an asset because they are using the bolt-action rifles, and they're really only effective from really long ranges. Close quarters with a bolt-action rifle, literally any of the other weapons is going to be able to take you out pretty quickly, including the pistols, I might add. To get a one-shot kill with a bolt-action rifle in this thing pretty much requires a headshot. And that's easier said than done at close range, let alone long range, when you're actually kind of in your element and you're far enough away that the enemy has a much harder time hitting you. But even then, pretty much the most use that a scout has for their team is simply to spot things for the rest of the squad. And that's really not all that useful in the grand scheme of things, because just about anybody can do that. In practical terms, what ends up happening with the scout class is that they hang really far back on the maps and try ineffectually to snipe enemies from a rather long distance, really not being all that useful for their team in the long run. This means that the more team-oriented players will avoid the scouts basically on principle, and the people who are getting mad because their team is losing are going to immediately start blaming all the scouts because, well, let's face it, they're just hanging back, not really doing all that much useful for their team. Usually. They do, however, get K bullets, which means that if they get really lucky, then they can do a fairly decent amount of damage to an armored vehicle, so they do have some degree of use. But when you look at things from a more practical perspective, considering how the vehicles actually are in this thing, K bullets really aren't all that useful. Because vehicles can repair themselves now. You can sit there and hold down a button to repair your vehicle, and it repairs in chunks of about 25 damage per. And while you are immobile while you're doing that, it doesn't really matter all that much because you're repairing damage that's being done to you, and if there's other people around you, or if there's people in your tank, for example, then they can just mow everybody down who even tries anything anyway. And considering the general lack of anti-vehicle weaponry, you either have to rely on field guns, which are in place positions that are very easy to be taken out, I might add, or you have to rely on a lot of people playing the assault class at any given point being able to hit the vehicles all simultaneously with their anti-tank weapons, or another vehicle just has to take it out, and that's a bit easier said than done sometimes. If you're in a tank, then they can take you out just as easily as you can take them out. And if you're in an aircraft that you're trying to take them out, well, just kind of good luck hitting them. Because the ordnance you're dropping really isn't all that accurate, so you kind of have to get in really close, which means that you're really vulnerable when you do that. And like in previous Battlefield games, you can in fact be sniped out of your plane, which is kind of amusing when it does happen, but it's pretty rare. So that is something to keep in mind as well. Something else to keep in mind is that if you spawn in a vehicle, which is the only way to spawn the vehicles on the map now, you are actually spawning in as a tanker or pilot class. And this basically means that you get a few anti-tank grenades, a repair tool, and a C96 carbine. That's pretty much it, really. You're really not all that useful on the ground when you're using that particular loadout, so if you do have to bail out of your vehicle, you are at a distinct disadvantage. This is something that was kind of problematic for previous Battlefield games in that you could spawn as whatever class you wanted, then hop into a vehicle. So you could spawn as an assault class, hop into a tank, drive it off, and do whatever you wanted with it, and then when time came to bail out, you'd hop out, and you'd just be able to tear into the enemy like it was nothing. This time around, you really can't do that unless you spawn into one of the existing vehicles, in which case you spawn as whatever class you decided to spawn as, and it basically just makes that a mobile spawn point that happens to be armored. You can also spawn into the airship or the armored train, and these don't affect your class either, so that is something else to keep in mind. Now, something else that can affect your class are the kits that you can find scattered around the battlefield. These are the sentry kits, as well as the flamethrower kits, and the tank hunter kit. Tank Hunter gives you the Tankgewehr, and it basically means that you're good for actually going up against armored vehicles. Sentry Kit will either give you the aircraft submachine gun or it will give you an MG08, and you'll be very heavily armored, meaning that you can't actually put on a gas mask anymore, but you can take a ridiculous amount of damage before going down. And then of course there's the Flamethrower class, which basically renders you immune to flames, and gives you a flamethrower with infinite ammo, so you can just roast pretty much anything. You also get incendiary grenades, and you're as resilient as a sentry, which is pretty crazy when you get down to it. You can have basically one of these people in these various kits just running around and completely dominating the area. Because there's really not all that much you can do against them. You can do a bayonet charge on them, and that's about the only way you can get close enough to actually take them down. But other than that, you basically just have to sustain fire on them until they finally go down, and that gets pretty ridiculous sometimes. The thing is that they really don't help your team out all that much. They're really more of a matter of, hey, here's some power weapons so you can get a bunch of free kills, basically. And that just does not jive well with the team-oriented gameplay that Battlefield is supposed to have. It's sort of the same problem that those particular weapons had in Battlefield 4 and Hardline, where they were just so ridiculously powerful compared to what you could spawn with, that they almost broke the game if you managed to get them. They're a distinct problem for the game's balancing, which is already tenuous at absolute best, and mostly just kind of all over the place. Like I said before, SMGs, shotguns, and LMGs pretty much just dominate the battlefield, and it gets pretty ridiculous the amount of bullet spray that goes on. There is not a single point throughout the entirety of this that feels like a proper World War I video game. If anything, it feels more like a combination of the Battlefront reboot as well as Battlefield 4 and Battlefield Hardline. Because they changed the progression to be a bit more like Battlefield Hardline, but they didn't quite go far enough. You see, in Hardline, you would earn currency, and you could use that to buy whatever you wanted within the scope of your given class. In Battlefield 1, you earn something called War Bonds, which you earn by simply leveling up, and you use these War Bonds to purchase weapons and gear for your various classes. Now, the thing is that they also put in a class leveling system, and it takes absolutely forever to level up your classes. To give you an idea, all of the classes start at level 0. To get all 4 of those up to level 1, not any further than that, just level 1, it took me 14 hours. Now with certain classes it's a bit easier than others. For example, a scout can get tons of XP for their class simply by spotting things. So you spew your spotting flare in the middle of a bunch of enemies, your team mows them down, you get tons of points for barely doing anything at all. Medics can get tons of points for healing people and reviving people, but when it comes to support and assault, The Assault class really doesn't get much other than just taking down enemies and occasionally taking out a vehicle, whereas the Support class gets a bit from resupplying their teammates, but more often than not they end up having to suppress targets and take out targets in order to be able to get their XP to level up. This means that, as I said, it can take absolutely forever to level those classes up, and it ends up just dragging the game to a screeching halt, simply because all the stuff you actually want to use, you have to level the class up to be able to use. Want the trench model of the Automatico? Well, you gotta level up your Assault class for that. Want the Benet Merci? Well, you gotta level up your Support class for that. Want a, well, halfway decent semi-automatic rifle? You gotta level up the Medic for that. It ultimately really doesn't matter how many war bonds you have, you still have to level up your classes to be able to actually buy the gear that you want to buy. This introduces a further level of grind than was in both Battlefield 4 and Battlefield Hardline. Because at least with Battlefield 4, once you got a certain amount of score within a class, then, well, you just got your new gun instead of having to actually go and buy it. And in Battlefield Hardline, you didn't have to level up for any of the guns at all. You just had to play the game, and eventually, once you earn enough currency, you can just buy the gun that you want. Now you're tied to leveling classes to unlock the gear in the first place, and then you have to level up your overall rank in order to get the war bonds you need to get that gear. And quite honestly, I wouldn't be surprised at all if DICE intentionally did that to incentivize the buying of shortcut packs later on, like they did with Battlefield 3 and 4. Because they've already monetized the hell out of the battle packs, which are a complete joke in Battlefield 1. They contain one of two things, a cosmetic item or a boost. And those cosmetic items are usually skins for guns that you don't actually have. So you can of course try to scrap those skins to earn scraps that you can eventually use to craft new, better battle packs that will give you more chances at higher tier skins, but then you actually get those crafted and it turns out to be not much better. But you know what, as problematic as they are in Battlefield 4, it doesn't really bother me quite as much that they're just kind of worthless in Battlefield 1. Like I said, the only things you can get from the battle packs are boosts, which just boost the rate at which you gain XP, and of course skins, which don't have any effect on the stats of the weapons anyway, so they don't really matter. What do matter more are the actual variants of those weapons, which can have a pretty profound impact on how they can handle. For example, the trench variant of submachine guns is going to function considerably better in hipfire than its other counterparts. Likewise, the sniper variant of the bolt-action rifles is going to have a bipod and a rather long-range scope, whereas the marksman variant is going to have a palm rest and a shorter range scope, and so on and so forth. Now you do get some very limited customization options with them. You can basically choose the zoom rate for aiming down the sights, you can choose the reticle for a scope, you can choose whether or not it has a bayonet on it, and that's kinda it actually. Because other than that, you don't get to mix and match attachments to change the actual performance of the thing. It's just a matter of you get what you get, and then you can customize some light cosmetics for them. That's it. Now on the one hand, this makes the game a bit more balanced because you can expect pretty much the same kind of thing from anybody using those weapons, but at the same time it means that you can't really customize any of the weapons to your liking, and you can't actually customize your character either. This is something they removed entirely. There is no soldier customization whatsoever. You can't put a camo on them, you can't change the way they look, they're just randomly chosen. And that's been a bit of a controversial decision for a lot of people because you end up with incredibly weird moments like your entire team on the German side being all dark-skinned, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. That's not to say that they don't deserve a place in the game at all, because there were certainly black soldiers in World War I. There were also Asian soldiers and Middle Eastern soldiers as well. But it's just baffling the amount of inclusiveness they've decided to throw in here, because World War I was not very inclusive, let's put it that way. I mean, to give you an idea, prejudice ran so deep back then that black soldiers weren't allowed to serve with white soldiers in the US Army. That's why the Harlem Hellfighters had to go serve with the French instead, because the French didn't care, they just needed bodies on the front, whereas the Americans were picky. But even though it does bother me that this thing is horrendously historically inaccurate, that's not really the main problem I have with this system. It's the fact that they outright removed a feature that was in the series for quite some time already. Hell, there was even some rudimentary character customization as far back as Battlefield Vietnam. And this thing doesn't even have that level of customization. It has none at all, and it's definitely a step back compared to all 3 of the previous games in particular. We expect progress, not regression, and that's precisely what they've done here. In fact, I wouldn't be remotely surprised if they tried to shoehorn character customization in later as a DLC. I mean, hell, they've already confirmed that even though the French aren't in the game yet, they're gonna be in the first DLC, which is incredibly insulting when you think about it, because they're basically saying that one of the absolute biggest factions in World War I doesn't deserve being in the base game. They deserve to be stuck in their own DLC that you had to get later that's gonna guaranteed have barely any content in it. But it's also just baffling from a thematic standpoint. Why include the Americans and not the French? It just doesn't make any sense when you think about it. World War I was certainly fought all over the place, but it was primarily a European war. And while the French certainly deserve one hell of a place in the game, they don't have one yet. They're going to be stuck in it as DLC later. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians are thrown in as DLC later either, because they're not in the base game, even though the Russian 1895 Winchester is. In fact, it's the primary armament if you're running around as a cavalryman, which is just kind of baffling. And while I'm on that particular subject, cavalry is kind of useless because it's really easy to pick them off from quite a distance away, so barely anybody wants to play cavalry except to just kind of mess around with it for a while. But I digress. Why are the French and the Russians not included in the game to begin with? Because DICE can sell them as DLC later. It's frankly pretty sickening when you think about it. And when you combine all of that with DICE's completely flippant attitude toward World War I, treating it as a playground for them to fart around with and see what nonsense they can create rather than treat it with respect and release something that is actually truly compelling, you get something that is a complete train wreck. This is easily one of the worst single-player components in any modern military shooter that I have ever played. The multiplayer is nonsensical, self-defeating garbage, and the monetization scheme that surrounds it is downright disgusting. And quite frankly, I'm legitimately shocked that people enjoy this garbage. I was actually legitimately tempted to give it a 0.5, but it's not quite that terrible. At least it works, and it works generally fairly well, so I'm giving it a 1 out of 5 instead. Avoid this game like the plague. Thanks for watching.